In this section, I'm going to be providing you with a brief review of trauma and trauma-informed and aware care. So what is trauma? I really like this quote by Basil van der Kolk, and it's saying that trauma is the result of exposure to an inescapably stressful event that overwhelms a person's coping mechanisms. In this, I think he really speaks to the subjectivity of trauma. And I really like the graphic of the volcano because I think if we're looking to conceptualize trauma, a volcano is very fair. When we talk about trauma with students and scholars, oftentimes I'll even use a pop bottle. But when we have trauma, things happen to us over time, and the more things happen, the harder we shake in the pop can example, until eventually we explode. And when we explode, just like the volcano, we don't necessarily have control over who that emotion and who that behavior goes on to, because we've hit the point in our own capacity where we are overwhelmed. Another important part to remember about trauma is that a lot of people have it. Any boundaries with regards to age, gender, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, geography, or sexual orientation. Trauma is one of the most universal experiences of people, especially people who struggle with mental health and substance use disorders. So with that, District 916 utilizes the 3 E's. This comes from the work of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, or SAMHSA. So decades of fieldwork have generated like multiple definitions of what trauma is. And SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, really dug through all of those varying works. And they developed an inventory of trauma definitions, and they recognized that there were some subtle nuances and differences in these definitions. However, there are some really substantial common themes as well. So they sought to conceptualize those commonalities into this definition. And what they're looking at in this conceptualization is the 3 E's: event, experience, and effect. This is also the definition that we provide for all of our new employees during onboarding. So as you're thinking through ways to bridge the work of Pcma to some of the other components in our district, just know that this is something that is provided. Basically, individual trauma results from an event or series of events in a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual physically and emotionally that is harmful and life-threatening, which has lasting adverse effects on that individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, and emotional and spiritual well-being. The cool part of trauma, which there is a cool part. The cool part of trauma is that it heals in the context of relationships. In the way this definition comes together, it also invites us to think about how relationally we can interrupt the potential adverse effect of trauma. So when our students, our peers, are experiencing an event, the circumstances that are experienced during that event don't necessarily have to be harmful if we are able to provide safe and supportive atmospheres and environments. And we do that through various different processes, which all come back to how we're developing our school culture. And we'll unpack that more in this presentation. Depending upon if that experience, regardless of how scary the event is, that experience is positive, we're then able to mitigate the potential adverse effects that significantly impact and impair one's functioning. So we can't talk about trauma without talking about the ACEs. So the Adverse Childhood Experience Study was a seminal study from Anda and Folletti that was done in the 1990s. And in this research, we can't talk about trauma without talking about ACEs. So the term ACE is an acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it really originated in this groundbreaking study that was conducted in 1995 by the Centers of Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, two key researchers, Anda and Folletti, and they performed that research out in California. In that study, ACEs really referred to three different specific kinds of adversity that children face in their home environment. Various forms of physical and emotional abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And they captured these three themes as identified in a 10-item questionnaire. So the key finding of this longitudinal study was that really two takeaways. One, adverse experiences are very common. As I mentioned in the past definition, trauma doesn't care who you are. It transcends all of those identity groups when we think about our intersecting identities. In the original study, I think they were surprised to find that the ACEs were common among the population in which the study was normed on, which was middle class. And in that middle class presentation, in the original study, more than 2/3 of the population experienced at least one ACE, and nearly a quarter reported to experiencing 3 or more ACEs. And I think the other key takeaway from the ACEs study is that there is a powerful and persistent correlation between having more adverse experiences and having a greater chance of poor outcomes later in life. Including dramatically increased risk of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, depression, substance abuse, poor academic achievement, early pregnancy, time out of work. And all of this eventually leads to factors for early death. And they have found that significant trauma and adverse experiences has led to taking off almost a decade out of a person's lifeline, which is really significant when you think about a decade ago, I was just starting grad school. That's weird. I thought I was going to say high school, but nope, grad school. Getting old is hard. Anywho, what we had done at 916 was we actually replicated that 10-item questionnaire with our students. So off on the left-hand side, the orange and yellow columns, we're comparing those to the brown columns all the way on the right-hand side. So students were able to, with permission from their parents, meet one-on-one with the school social worker and complete the ACEs study, or they were able to complete it online individually, utilizing one of our ThinkPads. What we found was really surprising to us as school social workers, in that the percentage of our students that reported no or only one adverse experience was actually much higher than we initially thought. And then as we were kind of breaking this down and doing consultation, one thing that became very apparent was part of the reason that our students weren't reporting to having more ACEs is because so many of them have normalized the experience of household dysfunction, neglect, and trauma, and that physical and emotional abuse. So just keeping that in mind. But this does give us a general sense of what it looks like in our 916 programs. We replicated this study one more time more recently, 2 years ago when Quora became the high school site. So for that study, we also added 5 questions based on the Philadelphia ACEs committee. So in the city of Philadelphia in 2017, they were looking through the 10-item questionnaire from the original ACEs. And as I mentioned earlier, the original ACEs was normed on a white middle-class population in California. The City of Philadelphia's commission did not feel that the original 10 questions on the survey was encompassing enough of a person with intersecting identities in relationship to race experiences, bullying, as well as what it is just to live in an urban environment. So they added 5 additional questions to that survey, and that survey is meant now to be more of a holistic snapshot into what the original 3 components were that they were seeking to research: that household dysfunction, the abuse and neglect. So looking at that, we use that survey, and that's the green column. It didn't necessarily add how many people were reporting ACEs. However, when we're thinking about honoring folks' intersecting identities, we felt like it was a much more equitable way of approaching the ACEs study. I want to spend just a minute talking about universal precautions. So as you know from our annual sign-offs, universal precautions is an approach to infection control in which we treat all human blood and certainly bodily fluids as if they were known to be infectious. This concept has really come up in the literature around trauma-informed and aware care, in that because, as I mentioned a slide ago, trauma is pervasive and a lot of people have it. If we approach with universal precautions, assuming that someone has had a traumatic experience, we're much more able to create a supportive environment in which all people, not just, but really thrive. And there's 5 components that are really necessary in order to ensure that we are providing that universal precaution best practice approach. 1, that we take into consideration the impact of pervasive crisis. If you think about the past 13, 14 months, we've actually been dealing with a dual pandemic. We've been dealing with the crisis of COVID-19 and how that has been a universal trauma, as well as the ongoing trauma of racial violence and uprising, especially in our communities here in Minnesota. So it's really important that we take into consideration the impact and how that presents in our classroom settings for our students and our staff. The second component of universal precautions is using therapeutic communication. And it's not necessarily heavy on the therapy side in the school setting, but it's heavy in the relational side. So I do want to frame that as using relational communication. How are we using our communication in all forms to bridge to have really strong relationships with our students and our staff? The third component is about not engaging in judgment. And that really comes back to a district culture value around who we are. And part of that is around learning. So if we are an educational institution, then all of us, including staff, are consistently learning and growing in our practices and as people. So in order to engage in that authentically, we all have to agree that it's a judgment-free zone. The fourth component is creating healing environments, and that goes back to all of those amazing Tier 1 things that we do at our sites and settings in order to ensure that we are giving students what they need, and when students are successful, staff are successful. And then the fifth component is that practice of self-care. And I struggle with the concept of self-care because so often it's put on us as practitioners to be like, well, it's on you to do self-care, figure it out outside of work. And to be more authentic, times self-care comes from this value of like consumption, right? So, oh, go do a pedicure, that's self-care. We don't want that. It's really about how we're creating this mindset of wellness that we're all engaging in. So considering that shift and how that needs to show up for universal precautions to be successful. Okay, so adopting a trauma-informed approach is not accomplished through any singular particular technique or checklist. It really requires constant attention, caring awareness, sensitivity, and a possibility to a cultural change at our organizational level in our district. And that is accomplished through these 6 tenets as outlined by SAMHSA. The first is safety. So throughout the district, staff and our students feel physically and physiologically safe. The physical setting is safe, which is certainly accomplished with our new sites especially, and the interpersonal interactions promote a sense of safety. Understanding safety as it is defined by our students really needs to be our highest priority, and that's something that we typically miss. So figuring out better ways as a district to center that student and family voice. The second component here is trustworthiness and transparency. So all of our district operations and decisions really should be conducted with transparency, with the goal of building and maintaining trust with our students and their family members and amongst our staff. Again, this is something that we're continuously working on, and we've made a lot of growth. I can say in my past 8 years at the district, I think we do a much better job now of telling people kind of the what and the why in order to ensure that they are able to share their voices and collaborate and co-construct our outcomes. And we still have a long way to go. Oftentimes our work ends up in silos, and that's one of the things we're addressing in this training today. Peer support. So peer support and mutual self-help are really key vehicles for establishing safety, hope, building trust, enhancing collaboration, and utilizing storytelling, which is really important as far as capturing that lived experience to promote recovery and healing. And when we're talking about peers here, we're talking about persons who've had the lived experience of trauma or secondary traumatic stress when we're thinking about our staff. So when we're really leaning into this idea of peer support, it's about that storytelling for us as staff when we've had hard things happen and we've been able to come out stronger and better on the other end. And for our students and scholars, it's this idea that they are able to share with one another as trauma survivors in a way that is managed with care. So thinking about our group settings that are provided by our mental health practitioners, Canvas Health has run some groups in the past too as our co-located partner. So giving people though the opportunity to hear that not only do we survive, but we thrive after hard things happen is important and integral to the healing process. Collaboration and mutuality. This is thinking about the importance that is placed on partnering and leveling of power differentials between our 916 district staff and among the families we serve. And really even among like professional staff to administration, from housekeeping personnel and clerical staff. It's really demonstrating that healing happens in authentic relationships and in the meaningful sharing of power and decision making. The school district has to recognize that everyone has a role to play in a trauma-informed approach. And as one expert said, and I really like this quote, one does not have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. I think oftentimes because we have so many amazing experts and specialists at our district, we forget that all of us own a piece of this work, and it is our collective responsibility to ensure that we are being therapeutic, but without asking anyone other than our mental health staff that are trained to be therapists. Empowerment, voice, and choice. Throughout the organization and among the students we serve, this is about really recognizing those individual student strengths and experiences and building upon them. As Shania talked about in restorative practices, or we'll be talking about in restorative practices, she highlights some important parts around how are we finding student leaders in restorative. So who are those students and scholars that are able to role model for their peers and serve as mentors? How are we as a district fostering a belief in the students we serve and their resilience and their ability as individuals and in the ability of our communities to heal and promote recovery from trauma, especially as we're thinking about navigating the dual pandemics of the past 15 months. How are we understanding the experience of trauma and how it may be a unifying aspect in the lives of those who support our district, who provide our services, and who come to our district for special education needs? Thinking about it in terms operationally as like workforce development and services that we ensure are organized to foster empowerment for staff and our students alike. Ensuring that our district understands the importance of power differentials and the ways in which our students historically and their families have been diminished in voice and choice and have often been the recipients of coercive school care. Students are supported in shared decision-making, choice, and goal setting to determine the plan of action that they need to ensure that they're moving forward. We're also ensuring that we're cultivating self-advocacy skills when we provide them these opportunities. Our 916 staff are really facilitators of recovery and healing rather than controllers of recovery and healing. And that goes back to thinking about school's not about compliance, it's about learning. So how are we building those learning opportunities so that we can facilitate that culture of healing and wellness? Staff must be empowered to do their work, as well as ensure that that work is done in a way that we as a district honor that work. So is self-determination for staff a part of this process? Do we honor each other as professionals? This goes back to that concept of parallel process. Staff need to feel safe as much as the students we're providing services to. The last component here that SAMHSA highlights is cultural, historic, and gender issues. This is a call to us as a district that we must actively move past cultural stereotypes and biases based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, religion, gender identity, geography, etc., and that we are offering access to responsive services that leverages the healing value of traditional cultural connections, ensures that we incorporate into our policies, protocols, and processes meaningful responses to racial, ethnic, and cultural needs of the students we serve, and that we're recognizing and addressing the historical trauma. And I'll get into that in just a moment. From the SAMHSA perspective, it's really critical to promote the linkage to recovery and resilience for our students and families that have been impacted by trauma. And when we're thinking about that, that ties into this definition here of these 6 key principles that support recovery services and supports that are trauma informed and build on best practices and evidence-based practices that are available for our students and family engagement to support empowerment and collaboration. Many things get passed through families, heirlooms, recipes, if you're Italian like me, genetic conditions, and physical characteristics. And what research is finding is that in some cases, trauma can be inherited too. Intergenerational trauma or transgenerational trauma is still a relatively new field of study, meaning researchers have a lot to do to discover about its impacts and how it presents in people who suffer from it. However, intergenerational trauma isn't just experienced by one person, but it extends from one generation to the next. And it can be silent, covert, undefined, and surfacing through many nuances that are inadvertently taught or implied throughout someone's life, really from an early age onward. This field of research began in 1966 with a Canadian psychiatrist, Viviane Rancoff, and her colleagues as they recorded a high number of psychological distress among children of Holocaust survivors. And from there, the concept of generational trauma was first recognized. However, except for studies related mainly to the Holocaust, the evidence base for this field is relatively young, and there are many unknowns. And while researchers have made great strides in understanding and treating single episode present life trauma, I think as a field, clinicians are really just beginning to explore the impacts of intergenerational trauma and its expression. However, the takeaway for us is that massive traumas affect people and societies in multidimensional ways. From this research, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who is an Indigenous doctor and licensed clinical social worker, really started to reflect and notice that for Indigenous peoples, historical trauma is present in this intergenerational transmission. And she defines historical trauma as this cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over a lifespan and across generations that emanates from a massive group trauma. Historical unresolved grief also accompanies that trauma. And when you think about it, right now we are living on and working on Dakota and Ojibwe land. And these nations people were forcibly removed. However, they're still connected to this territory. And so often we forget that in our narrative. For Indigenous people, the origins of trauma are in genocide. The boarding schools compounded the trauma, and then trauma has been transferred across generations through impairment of traditional parenting skills, cultural identification, and other complex processes. So while the area of transgenerational trauma is still developing, as I said earlier, in psychological theory, Black and African American researchers like Dr. Joy DeGruy have really paved the way for necessary conversations about the socialization of trauma in the Black and African American community. And in her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, she really delves into the intersectionality of American chattel slavery, racism, and trauma. When we are thinking about this as 916 employees with an equity lens, we need to keep in mind that problem behaviors of individuals cannot be understood in isolation from the economic, political, cultural, and historic conditions which have given rise to those maladaptive behaviors. And as a method of practice, we need to ensure that when we're working with individuals, families, and communities, we understand the personal, cultural, and institutional factors that contribute to the identified, quote, problem behavior, and act to change the conditions, not just the behavior. We need to ensure that we are taking a stance where we are supporting the liberation from internal and external oppressions for our students and families. Commonly, there is a disconnect in our practice between a student's trauma experience or adverse childhood experience score and that student's lived experience outside and inside of the school. They're vastly different. This is where trauma-informed work in schools can become problematic. And as educators, we are committed to serving students managing trauma. Oftentimes, despite individual efforts, though, the school systems remain in a place that is traumatizing and re-traumatizing students outside of the classroom. And that's really what this infographic gets to. Treating individual traumas without naming systemic injustice means our schools don't just risk leaving some traumas unrecognized, it means we risk re-traumatizing students. And policies that regulate students' behavior are another way schools might be traumatizing students. Particularly insidious are rigid behavioral or disciplinary policies that cloak our own inflexibility as lessons that are lessons meant to taught responsibility. Really, as a school system, once we've begun to question our own curriculum, policies, and practices that might be traumatizing or re-traumatizing our students, then we take a step towards healing. When we are thinking about adopting a trauma-aware view, and these are some points I really encourage you to take back to your PCMA training, these key points here for us highlight how we are able to ensure that we're developing that strong foundation of relationship that's authentic in order to ensure that we are developing that healing environment, because relationship is what is the driving force for healing from trauma. And this comes to the idea that people want to do well, but lack skills. So thinking of Ross Greene, it's a can't, not a won't. Thinking about how behavior meets a need. One of my favorite professors, Dr. Ann Garrity, would always say, before we move to change a behavior, we should step back and admire a behavior. Even though behaviors can be maladaptive, the fact that a child is resourceful enough to come up with a way to get their own needs met without the support of adults is pretty amazing. And figuring out how to capitalize on the strengths that are underlying maybe that maladaptive behavior itself also supports that healing environment. Restorative work, which Shanae is going to talk much more in depth about in the next section. Taking a collaborative approach, I've talked about pretty much ad nauseum and will continue to. Ensuring that we're teaching expectations and offering predictability. When we utilize PCMA strategies in our buildings, it is important that we let students and scholars know what PCMA is and why we utilize it, and let them know when we fade and how we fade so that they understand the rules of the game. Quote, game. Ensuring that staff get what we need, and I talked about that a little bit earlier, but ensuring that we have professional discretion, that we're supported by our organization, that we feel seen and heard and honored and valued. Equity, which connects to all of our work, and then user-friendly language. This is that invitation for folks to co-construct and collaborate with us. However, schools in particular really love our acronyms. So how are we breaking down our language in a way that offers an invitation for folks that we work with and communities to be a part of the conversation, as opposed to creating unnecessary barriers? At this time, I invite you to engage in the reflection, which you can fill out later on in this Google form. Question 1. What strategies do you already employ that promote resilience and social emotional learning in your school or classroom? Question 2. How do you help others feel supported and effective? And question 3. What is one new trauma-informed strategy you will commit to implementing in your PCMA training?